Okay, so let's see how this goes. Okay, so I'm going to try to be presenting one of the core topics that make up the subject of I don't know I don't have a unified word for it, but my psychological research is made up of two theories which are intermingled. They interface with each other, but they could generally be divided as two separate subfields. The one I call metatype, and the other one I call metagram. This says metatype model of psyche, overlays onto the 17 model of cognitive functions. So this diagram here is going to not be familiar, but it's going to be perhaps recognizable to some people in the MBTI world, in the Myers-Briggs personality type indicator world, that know about the four sides of the mind. They could, so the triangles are the child functions, the squares are the dominant functions, the big circles are the parent functions, and the diamonds are the inferior functions. And then I've got something which I call the death, which is also the diamond. But the death, for one side of the mind to have an inferior function, that inferior function is the death of the next side of the mind, because in my model the sides of the mind overlap one another. You can see I've borrowed some terminology from John Vervaeke to add a layer of description, but I've also got my descriptive layers here, which I will talk about. And just to say that the child function as well also has a double role. I call it the sin as well, but the sin is not the child function. The child function of one side of the mind is not the sin of that side of the mind. So you can see that, for example, here the subconscious, the diamond is its death, the death could also be called the foundation or the limit. So I'm getting right into terminology here. And then it has its child function, its dominant function, its parent function, and then its inferior function, and then its sin, which doubles up as the child function of the unconscious side of the mind. So the inferiors and the sins have a kind of dual use between two sides of the mind. And the only parts of the sides of the mind which are unencumbered by this dual use is essentially the dominant function and the parent function, although the ego and the superego are unique because the ego's inferior function is not encumbered by the superego, so it is also open, or it's as independent as the dominant and the parent function. And the superego is also kind of unique and different to the other sides of the mind in that it also has three unencumbered elements in it. But instead of having its own unencumbered inferior function, it has an unencumbered child function. So in some sense, the superego houses the only independent child function in the whole, what I would call the false ego complex, and the ego houses the only unencumbered or the only inferior function that isn't dual use. Okay, and that is simply because the sin of the ego is the foundation of the superego. So falling in between the inferior and the child. So this thing is a bit of an anomaly. And this is the same thing as that. It's just because this is a cylinder from left to right. So this perforated line here is meant to join up here. And so, you go from ego to superego, and here it's showing the ego to superego on this side. So this is just, here's a diagram where all that stuff is left out, and then you just have to kind of imagine these two perforated lines meeting, in a cylinder that wraps all the way around. But yeah, I just think that this is probably easier to see what's going on. Okay, so this is the basic structure, and I'm sort of throwing people into the deep end here, but I think this is actually better to start in the middle. So the other thing here is that people will say, well, why you, well, I mean, they might have a lot of questions coming from the Myers-Briggs personality sort of edifice, because in the Myers-Briggs edifice, which is almost the same like socionics, is that you will just have 4 or 8 slots of cognitive functions. You'll have a model for one type, and it'll be populated by cognitive functions. And even if you know perhaps 2 or 3 of the cognitive functions, you can, following, if you know the right 3, you know the rest of the cognitive functions because it follows a formula. And so this is different because the formula comes in the structure or my theory of cognitive functions, which is I also basically link this to metatype. So if you count this black dot here, which is the same as that black dot, this is the same black dot, which is the anomalous sin of the ego, which is also the foundation of the superego, which is different because here the foundation of all these other ones are the diamonds, or the inferior functions. So the inferior function of the superego is the foundation of the subconscious. The inferior function of the subconscious is the foundation of the unconscious, and the inferior function of the unconscious is the foundation of the ego. It's the condition that gets sort of codified into a solid limit premise or something like that, and based on the conditioning provided by that inferior function, which is also negotiated, which I'm going to talk about how the inferior function sort of so there's, it's a bit of a contested ground, because something that is somebody else's inferior function that is also the foundation of another side of the mind is going to be sort of hotly contested. And so the inferior function is also called the ignoring function, because in some sense one side of the mind has to leave enough of some point of view alone so that it can service as let's say the hard undergirding structure that can allow for a whole new perspective to emerge within its ambit. And sorry, I'm saying a lot of things which rely on my theory of cognitive functions, which is part of Metatype. Sorry, let me just quickly. Okay, so these are both the same. So I don't have to specify, oh, this person's parent function has got this cognitive function, and then that inferior function is this other cognitive function, because that metatype thing that we were just looking at, that has the 2 perforated lines, it basically has 18 things, and the 18th thing is repeated, is the sin. And so it always goes in the same sequence. So if your superego foundation is going to be one of these dimensions, and then flowing from that, everything else is just a sequitur. And I'll just say as well that this is not important for the structure of the theory, but my naming convention for metatypes is the unconscious dominant function. So everyone is named after their unconscious dominant function. So I'm a metatype 13. That means my unconscious dominant function is the 13th dimension over here. Um, and this is a better detail of the of the 17 cognitive functions, and just I repeated 17 just to show that after 17 one happens. So like one happens, you know, so when you go above 17 it goes back down to one. There's also another reason why I'm showing 17 twice here, but I'll talk about that at some other point. So yeah, so my theory of cognitive functions is far more elaborate, and actually, you know, it's not just look in MBTI, which you know has its almost its same roots that socionics has in terms of its cognitive functions. Were just taken from Carl Jung, and so you know. It would have been nice if I also had those pictures lined up, but in Jung's book on Plato, on Plato and alchemy, he has a divided line, which then he divides up furthermore into subcategories, and so it actually looks like a table of 16 groups. And he's got like handwritten notes on this table, which essentially is meant to sort of map the divided line. I have basically taken a very similar alchemical process to developing my cognitive functions. So although it's also much more complicated, but I don't know if I want to talk about this now. But yeah, there are a lot of ways to subcategorize the dimensions of psychological reality. The most important thing at this point is just that they follow a basic sequence, and that sequence has many implications for how they function as creatures, as beasts onto themselves in some sense. And the ones that are beastly are the ones that have these little alchemical, these are meant to be alchemical symbols. This is earth, the one with two circles is air, the square is water, the triangle is fire. That's all of them. So please don't be confused. These symbols have nothing to do with the symbols on the metatype model that I was just showing you. So this triangle does not mean the child function, and this square does not mean the dominant function. I'm sorry that I haven't used novel symbols, but you know, it's nice to use simple symbols. But yeah, please don't be confused. This has nothing to do with parent functions or child functions. Okay, and then these colors also have significances. I'll just say that just at this point, because I'm not going to explain it in a detail, but you'll notice that there's a pattern. It goes brown, gray, pink, brown, gray, pink. So I'll just point that out. Yeah, and then these five over here that just have these solid colors here, and I've also put them in sort of reddish pink on the side here as opposed to blue. Anyway, I will usually refer to these as the final five. They stand outside of these other ones, and the main distinction is that these final five have to do with the part of consciousness that is the container of mental objects. It has to do with the constituents of the thinker. So the verb of, so these final five have to do with the verb of thinking, whereas the rest are the actual mental objects themselves, the actual objects of thought themselves. the actual contents of the mind. So the one is almost like the conscious, the conscious container, and the rest are what is inside the container. So these five are in a sense almost more a priori, and the blue ones are more a posteriori in terms of, anyway, that's a kind of philosophical analogy, but in some sense the final five precede mental objects, but also what they do can also vastly color or shade or filter, perhaps, but because in some sense, you can an object can appear different based on how you subjectively cast it or subjectively construe or perceive or view it. So sort of you can, anyway, so you can see here that I've got a lot of religious things written all over the place, and I'd like for people not to be too upset or prickled about it. In some sense, I believe religion essentially was the first method of understanding psychology, essentially. That all religion is trying to understand, is the first research into psychology, and the first endeavor to understand psychology. And it just so happens that when you try to understand psychology at a very, very deep level, you have to use allegory, you have to use metaphor, just to keep track of things as well, because also the necessity of mystery, essentially, is that things are complicated, and you also need to know the effects that certain things have on other various different levels. And that level of complexity needs to be you can't keep on making technical distinctions, because no one will have the patience to sort of see the last page of the algebra to then see how it works as sort of in full swing. So you have to work out something like a spiritual language, and this can obviously get you into trouble, because allegory can take on a kind of dogmatic life of its own, and it can sort of be evolved or bastardized or sort of be used imprecisely. And so, I do think that it's very important to get the doctrine dead on, because otherwise you make lots of problems and things like that. So anyway, I'm just going to say that I believe that there's a perfectly good sort of secular way to translate and understand all of these religious things that you might see scattered in my work, but it's very helpful to see the very robust picture of it, which, yes, looks confusing, and what are the implications of that, and how does it leads on to that. But in some sense, the final five is some of these things which you can't dispense with that kind of complexity, because it is going to be far-reaching and profound. I don't know why I didn't write the blood here. Dimension 7 is the blood. But anyway, okay, let me not look at that. Sorry. Okay, so so I think let's just talk about this metatype model of psyche before I go into trying to justify some of the technical aspects of how, what the implications of the 17 model of the cognitive, let's say the natural cognitive stack or something like that. And maybe I'll superficially get into it talking about this. So this is quite tangible, especially for people coming from Myers-Briggs, because they know what a child function is, they know what a dominant function is, they know what the parent function is. Now, I probably have different views on some of these things, and my views are probably a bit scattered and scant, because I must say I haven't been dealing with this for a long time, because I've considered metatype to not be where my problems are at the moment. I need to do clerical things to work out stuff in Metagram, which I'm not even going to bring up here because I haven't introduced yet. But I guess I will be introducing it when I talk about these things, because devotion and declaration, answer and prayer, worship and oath, these things are the integration of how Metagram fits into Metatype. So what is being negotiated here between these two parent functions, and I do believe that it is predominantly the parent functions that are negotiating this foundation of the subconscious, because essentially, even if you want to say that it's the dominant function, and it's maybe the child function as well, is that it has to go up the chain of command, because the parent function is going to be proceeding in dimensionality. So if I'm a metatype 13, that means that my dominant function over here is 13. This is dimension 12, this is dimension 11, this is dimension 10, this is dimension 9, and this is dimension 8, and this is dimension 7. And so anyways, I'm just giving an example of how this would be read for a particular metatype. So dimension 7, 8, and 9 over here I should have talked about the pyramid when I was on that screen. So basically the reason why I sometimes show it as a pyramid is because all higher dimensions are directed by lower dimensions. And all lower dimensions support higher dimensions fundamentally. And so in some sense, a higher dimension exists inside of the lower dimension, but has a smaller footprint, because in some sense it's leaving the lower dimension behind. But what it loses in scale, it gains in essentially, I guess you could call it directorship. So it's sort of like it sees itself as a more central pivot until you reach the apex of the pyramid, until you reach sort of dimension 17, which is the very tip of the pyramid, and then like sort of mysteriously, when you reach a point, it becomes the center of everything, which is the center of dimension 1. So, you reach such an infinitesimal point that it somehow implies the entire base of the entire structure, and then you kind of begin again from the bottom of the pyramid after reaching the apex. So, and I'll just say that how that kind of works in the logic of the cognitive functions is that the 17th dimension of cognitive reality is extroverted sensing how things are, or how it is. I can phrase it sort of both ways, depending if you want to say it's in the first person perspective or as a kind of sort of second person interrogative, like, so I mean, or third person. So like, I mean, this is why the long form of those dimensions have kind of two versions there. this has always been difficult in terms of how to format this for a reader, because especially when you're trying to point at something that's directly inside their consciousness, so I'm trying to name the form of the form of cognition that falls into the formula of how things are. So and in some sense, what that is meant to imply, how things are, is the most immediate thing. So that's the dimension of reality in which the only thing that exists is the thing that is happening here and now in the present, how things are. And somehow the present contains everything else as well. It has within it the propensity to unfold and to create the rest of, or to unfold the rest of creation within the creation of how things are. So how things are is anything and everything, because in some sense how things are also perhaps could be said to retain its history as well, or at least whatever resources the history make amenable to the present. So the whole of reality is reducible into how things are, but it's very particularized into the present tense. Why am I going on and on about dimension 17? Just wanted to give it an example. So that is the apex dimension, is dimension 17. And then the first dimension of psychological reality is, which I sort of call instinct. I've given all of these things like a one-word name. All of the object cognitive functions, not the subjective cognitive functions, but the objective, of which there are 12. So the first dimension I call what will be, or instinct, because it is your sense of what will be. It's always, in some sense, which I also call the flesh sometimes. But anyway, so that is the most basic cognitive function, and in some sense, the sense of what will be is the foundation of all the other cognitive functions, or all the other cognitive functions are a subtraction from what will be into a more particular form. But it's kind of like a chain of, it has to be supported by what will be in order to at least be in your mind. So it's interesting that I guess a lot of people link the concept of flesh to the actual physicality of the world, or something like that, or the materiality of the world. I actually link flesh to mind. In my view, the flesh is the flesh of thought. So being alive means having flesh, means being capable of producing thoughts and thinking, essentially. I don't want to get into a whole lecture of the 17, but essentially okay, so 17 to 1 is probably sort of one of the most sort of interesting jumps, because I mean, for someone this is going to, the dominant function is going to be 17, and the parent function over here is going to be dimension 1. But essentially what I'm saying is that dimension 1, essentially, I think, because they're both independent. Both the dominant function and the parent function are the only independent cognitive functions in the subconscious. And so together, I think, but almost predominantly the parent function will probably collate and sort of finally decide what the feedback of the declaration is going to be to the ego's dominant and parent's input. So that's going to give an input, and this is going to give a kind of ensnaring capture, because this has to create its own side of the mind. So it has to negotiate with the output of the ego and sort of create some kind of settlement here. Well, it's in some sense, although this is probably the most unique setup here with the ego, superego, and subconscious, because the ego and the superego are the most asymmetrical from the other ones, and the subconscious, in my view, is the first to form after the ego. So I should probably have said this. So in my model, or in my conjecture, I believe that ontologically the superego is what we're basically born with, and the ego is in a very much like a dreamlike state until it can sort of stabilize itself, and it only properly stabilizes itself once we kind of have a subconscious, and the subconscious itself only stabilizes itself once we have an unconscious, and then we've got everything anyway. But you only start really maturing in adulthood, or let's say sort of when you're from the age of 12, 13, kind of proper teenage years. I think that's when this starts to crystallize, and when this can start to develop then. Because this is needed to stabilize the subconscious. While this is unstable, the subconscious has a lot of leeway, and that's probably sort of the most enjoyable part of the development of the false ego complex, because you're kind of storing up all the cognitive dissonance and tension over here, and you're still hoping that the subconscious can sort of be the lifeboat of what has already sort of transpired. And once you start actually having to crystallize the unconscious, then you realize that you're in a bear trap and there's no escape. But there's no real point in trying to devolve and go back and develop backwards. You have to kind of develop forwards, and sort of, and that's, in some sense, that's what traditional Christianity has vaguely gotten right about, sort of its disciplinarian focus on certain things. But there's so many things that have been gotten so wrong in the doctrine that I think that there's too much uselessness in so-called Christianity. But anyway, okay, so I should just also admit that I've got some ambiguity here, that I'm not exactly sure if the child function is really going to be part of informing this inferior function. But in some sense, the child function is going to have an effect on the dominant function, and the dominant function is going to have an effect on the parent function anyway. So by that normal chain of succession or procession, because this is always going from left to right. So if that was in I'm a metatype 13. This is dimension 3 in a metatype 13. This is dimension 4. The dominant function is dimension 5, and the parent function is dimension 6. And so anyway, the dimension 6 is going to produce the answer. Now, I used to have arrows on these connections. I'm not going to put arrows anymore, because it's anyway, I think it's needed just to say that they're connected. To put an arrow, I think, sort of implies things that that it's a very kind of strict mechanical kind of process. But because in some sense, I think the prayer can give a kind of feedback, and the answer. Yes, so I think that this connection can almost go both ways in terms of how this is being negotiated, the inferior function over here. But anyway, okay. So the reason why I've got all these different terminologies is because the point of my theory is not just because essentially this is like a replacement of MBTI. This is like a much more detailed and sophisticated model of mind that has a theory of cognition behind it, which is much more robust than just having 8 cognitive functions. Although as you can see, that I use in the diagram that I showed before, that I use the 8 cognitive functions just to make people who are familiar with MBTI familiar with gives them some footing of conversion and translation from that model. Oh yeah, so I was just going to say that, yeah, I don't know what the child function here, if it really could be said, but I mean, talking about this is the most asymmetrical part of the false ego complex, and I'm going to get into explaining what my current interpretation of what's going on here, and also that will outline a general theory of self-actualization, or at least speculation on a decent, and I think almost conceptually it's workable, and I think it actually holds a lot of promise. But anyway, and then I don't know if this inferior function has anything to do with this devotion. I don't know if the inferior function has, if the inferior function can have the capability of actually providing feedback against this parent function. I think that you can change the state of this parent function and this dominant function, but you have to do so through the oath and through the other sides of the mind, in some sense, which, you know, it all ends up leading. I mean, the one thing which is perhaps not obvious to see here is that there are actually 2 independent circuits here. That the devotion goes to the declaration, goes to the worship, goes to the oath, goes to the devotion, and the answer goes to the prayer, goes to the question where it ends, and you could say it starts with here. So this second circuit is a broken circuit, but the oath, devotion, declaration, worship, oath, that is a contiguous loop in some sense. So in some sense, the metagram portion of Metatype could be seen as having 2 independent circuits within it, although there's a kind of cross-pollination here, because every time you have a parent function, it's going to be bordering, generally speaking, an inferior function of the other circuit. And so there's a kind of, perhaps, almost like a kind of capacitor action, where, you know, sort of, if charge is going to, a charge of a particular kind is going to be held in this inferior function, it's probably going to induce some compensatory or sympathetic action, perhaps, that it's going to, but in some sense, most parent functions don't care about their local inferior functions. They want to ignore them. But obviously, if we're getting into integration territory and we want to start integrating things, then you know, then this communication starts happening more, and then you actually have some mechanics at work which can help you bring a general resolution to what's going on here. So this is going to maybe sound a bit horrible to some people, but let me start talking about some things in the scriptures that maybe I think are references to these structures which I have modeled and discovered, perhaps. So if you just count all the independent things here, you'll find that there are 10 independent things here. You have 3 in the superego, 3 in the ego, 2 in the unconscious, and 2 in the subconscious. That makes 10, and I think that refers to the 10 horns of the beast. Also in Revelations and other places, it talks about the unclean. I might be talking slightly. You might have gotten this, but I know the objects here. I might be getting sort of the order a bit wrong, but essentially, it talks about that there are. I think there are. See, I might have this backwards, but anyway, this structure is basically described is that I think it says there are three unclean spirits, or it's that there are three things which sort of, their frogs come out of their mouths. And the three things, which are either the unclean spirits or the frogs or the unclean spirits coming out of their mouths, is the dragon, the false prophet, and the beast. And I think that the dominant function in the ego might be the dragon. The parent function in the ego could refer to the false prophet, although I also like thinking that the super-ego's parent function is also quite thematically linked with the false prophet. And the inferior function in the ego, I think, is linked with the beast. And that is to say that these things are saddled with those things. It's not that they are these things, but these are the things that have to be cleared, especially the inferior function, because I think that this inferior function is the door to freedom. The ego's inferior function, which I think if it's doing its job properly, it should be trying to get responsibility for all the other three sides of the mind. Or specifically the subconscious and the unconscious, and the ego should have its responsibility concentrated within the ego's inferior function. Because if this can take responsibility, perhaps the superego as well, if this can take responsibility for everything, then this becomes the seed of the new personality, I think. And this is also what I think the crucifixion is related to, is that you have to die to yourself, so you even die to your own responsibility perhaps, and you're crucified because of the sin, which proceeds after the inferior function. So in some sense, the inferior function finds the sin very unfair, because it proceeds after it. And in some sense, I think it's generally projected by the child function in the superego. So anyway, what I'm trying to describe is also a bit of a trick, because it's also a bit of a kind of a mockery, or because in the same way that when Christ was dying, I think it's a bit of a mockery, because he's taking responsibility for things that, what kind of justice would you call that, So this is the position, I think, of this inferior function. And you have to you really have to want to take the responsibility for all these things. And in some sense, it's not a mockery, because the superego is part of you. And in some sense, what you're doing is going to allow this inferior function to gain access to this dominant function, which is where I think it wants to be. I think that this dominant function, the superego, is in fact the New Jerusalem. And you need the inferior function and the dominant function to essentially be merged together, and they need to both act as child functions that leave this child function in the dust, because that is what has been giving this false prophet, the parent function, the superego, the scope to substitute the child's insight. I do think that this child function is giving an exorbitant amount of power to the parent function, because the parent function is judging that the ego, which the sin, because the sin is the sin of the ego, it's the foundation of the superego, but the superego derives all of its power from the sin of the ego, and it keeps this parent function operating, I believe, as a kind of god of the world. This is a kind of secret controller, and sorry, I'm really going all over the place. I will neaten it up at the end here, but I'm just trying to mechanically kind of describe the complexity of all the things that are going on here. And I'm doing so by first saying what I think the solution is, and then I'm describing the problem. So maybe slightly back to front. But essentially, what is very interesting is if you know someone's metatype and you look at their superego dominant function, you will realize just how thematically their life centers around this dominant function. This dominant function will be one of the loudest undergirding themes that essentially dominate their entire life in some sense, dominate the narrative of their life. It's somewhat like almost a disembodied, it's the theme of their book, in their book of life essentially, is dominated by this, and they're quite rich in this. But it comes to no avail. It comes, it's pent up potential energy, which they are almost a master at, but they feel incredibly impoverished of this thing. And that is all because this is lacking. The ego is definitely falling short of this. It knows that it's falling short of this. And so this is judging this value, this child value in the superego is judging the ego to be in a state of sin. So this is the missing of the mark, which is being projected by this child function. And this inferior function just has to take it. It just has to be responsible, because that's the way it is. This is how it was set up, in some sense. And, I think that ontologically, when the ego forms, it doesn't form the inferior function first, or actually, it might actually, but it does it in a very cerebral way. It does it when you're forming this, maybe to begin with, you actually know that you're creating a mock identity for yourself. Like, people forget this stage of development, but they actually hypnotize themselves into creating an ego from their superego perspective. They contract themselves into it, and this becomes a kind of sacred contract. And they're forever playing this game with themselves, and they are the game master behind the scenes. But they have to play the actual game piece, which is this thing over here. And they want to be very, very clever about it and do these sorts of things. But it all hinges on essentially being under the contract, which anyway, this ends up becoming a bit excruciating, the inferior function, and it's either ignored, and then you're sort of engaging in these things in some kind of very bad faith, and usually that bad faith is usually collected around the unconscious. But anyway, I don't want to talk about other sides of the mind right now. That's usually where all the sort of the cognitive dissonance often is also going to be unique and different for each types, because these metagram things are have their own very complicated set of mechanics and peculiar, unique features. But anyway, that's something we don't need to talk about right now. So, what can I say? Okay, so my view is that the hardest part is the crucifixion, because even if you know that you need to take responsibility for the inferior function, the actual act of doing it, in some sense, requires mocking it up and actually practicing it in some sense, and developing towards it, kind of fake it until you make it, essentially. And that's perhaps a slightly awkward way of trying to get what I'm trying to say across. But in trying to do this as a dry run, in some sense, trying to attune your inferior function and your dominant function into making that a new child function, means that you are trying to avoid this hurt, because this child function is very, very nasty, and it's put you in a state of shock, in a state of mora, in a state of you're directly impinged against these accusations that are formed by this, and that is going to transfix you into a state of atrophy and into a state of essentially being overwhelmed, and then you fall back into the status quo, as it were. And so what you do is you try to bypass this, and I think that this is what it means to wait in your grave after the crucifixion. And so, you're dead on the first day, you're dead on the second day, or is it on the third? Oh, okay. So either you're dead here and you come to life on the third day. Anyway, so I don't know how people count three, because it was on the third day. You're supposed to wait 3 days in your grave. So I don't know if that the evening count, if this would be the evening, and then morning in the evening, and then morning you are resurrected here. But this is what is being resurrected. This is what is saved to become the new personality over here, and this is the New Jerusalem. But even trying to establish the New Jerusalem, then the frogs are going to come out of the mouths, because as you try to do that, then these things are going to fight you back. You're going to have the unclean spirits, the frogs of these things are going to come out of their mouths. All of these dominant functions left behind here, that's the dragon, all of these parent functions are going to be the remnants of the false prophet. Because this I think is the actual false prophet. But you have been operating the circuit for such a long time that this content has been imbibed and has been mirrored within these independent nodes of operating within each side of the mind. So these things have got a residual charge of the false prophet. And so you need, and also the inferior functions as well are also going to kick back. And I think that that's the beast. Because, you need these things to be in good working order so that they can pass on their responsibility to the inferior function in the ego. You need this to be the apex responsibility. But to do that, you have to get all of this in working order. You can't let them have their own cognitive function, their own cognitive dissonances. If they are left in their cognitive dissonances, then there's no... this is not going to be able to be translated into the dominant function to essentially displace the great city of Babylon with the New Jerusalem. And this is the false prophet, which will become the tree of life in the midst of this, in the center of the city. Anyway, so that's my general view of self-actualization at the moment. Okay, now, wow, I've really talking about things that. Okay, so I think that this might be useful for me, even though I'm kind of starting a bit at the end, and then I'm going to work backwards. That's perhaps at least going to give some general framework of some basic structures for me to start going into. So I think I'll rather keep these as separate videos. So maybe I'll stop this recording and go directly into talking about the 17 cognitive functions, or I'll talk about Metagram, these Metagram emotional tones, which are cognitive inflections. So when I don't know how I refer to them. I think I refer to them as just Metagram or Metagram emotional tones. But emotional tones are, in my theory, comprised of cognitive functions. And so essentially I have a very complicated set of cognitive axes. So some people from MBTI, also from Four Sides of the Mind, but or even without Four Sides of the Mind, people would perhaps know of cognitive axis theory or cognitive axes. I basically have a much more sophisticated kind of cognitive axes. In fact, I would say that my model was actually the reason why cognitive axes exists. Actually, I mean, unless I'm a crazy person, that's exactly where it came from discussion in my living room with 3 other authors. But anyway, and John, and it's so embarrassing that I'm so bad with names, but John Beebe was one of them, although he was not really participating that much. I had to talk to him by himself at the end. But anyway, yeah, these are the complexities of cognitive axes, all condensed in one diagram, but I have to talk about all of these symbols, and these are the field circuit cognitive axes. So these are the simple ones. These are the, you see all the arrows here, that like the blue arrows and the red arrows and the yellow arrows. These are the yellow and the red and the blue. And then the complexities are the symbols on top of that. This is what the field circuits look like in terms of how they correspond with one another. Yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of previewing this, but yeah, so I need to explain Metagram, yeah, the actual. So I didn't talk about, I should maybe make a more basic recording about child functions and dominant functions, and for people that aren't familiar with Myers-Briggs. Anyway, okay, so yeah, I guess I'll see how this goes.